You are watching or listening to Music Club, and in this edition we are going to be talking about Dr. Robert and the Blow Monkeys, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
And I'm John.
And so this episode is going to be slightly different. I mean, every time we do Music Club, it's in a kind of slightly different format because we have to format the episodes according to our knowledge of the bands and so on. And in this case, my knowledge of the band is going to far outstrip John's. So basically, I'm going to try and tell a story in this episode of the podcast. And the story I'm going to tell is probably going to be as much about a person who follows a band and buys their records or not, as it is going to be about the band themselves. And so I'm hoping that by doing it in this kind of a format, what we'll do is come up with a story, parts of which anybody listening or watching, even if they don't like Dr. Robert or the Blow Monkeys necessarily, will just recognise examples of things that they've done or that have happened in their lives. I mean, assuming that they like music and bands and so on. So that's kind of what we're going to do. So I'm going to try and make sure John doesn't get left out completely, but we'll just have to see how this conversation develops because we've not done it quite like this before. So, John.
What could go wrong?
Exactly. Well, I could say John, hoping that you'd speak long enough for me to have a swig of a cup of tea find myself.
I can do that, yeah. I mean, I come from this as kind of the average person, slightly more than the average person in the streets knowledge of the Blow Monkeys. Obviously, I know from JR talking about it many times on the podcast and with his other podcast with Dr. Robert. But my main knowledge would be, the hits in the 80s, Digging Your Scene, Wait, etc. And then because JR and Simon recommended it to me, the latest album as well, Journey to Time.
Journey to You.
Journey to You. Thank you.
Yeah, because I think most people, if they don't know the Blow Monkeys beyond the hits, have probably got a really sort of unrepresentative picture of the band, because those hits really aren't at all what sort of 85% of the band's output has been like. But that's something that we'll get into as I sort of tell the story, I guess. But there's something else I wanted to bring up before I get into it, because I think also what this episode of the podcast is going to be about, perhaps, and this is hopefully where I'll bring you in, John, as much as I can. And we were supposed to have Simon here, and I think Simon would have been good on this, but unfortunately Simon's got bogged down in all sorts of stuff that he has ended up sort of finding himself having to do. And he was running, I don't know, he thought he was running about an hour behind the two of us, but judging by the sound of what he was up to, he's probably nearer 2 hours behind, I should have thought. Anyway, he couldn't make it. So I want to talk about why we like the bands we do and dislike other bands that we might not necessarily expect ourselves to dislike. And we are going to discuss bands that Simon's going to like, that I don't like as much, but that I probably should. And I think one of the reasons for that is something I brought up on one of the podcasts I've done with Dr. Robert over the last few months, and which probably most people listening to this or watching it won't have heard. So I'm going to bring it up again now, because I think this kind of speaks as a metaphor to the reasons why we like the things we do. And I think it goes beyond bands into books and films and all sorts of other things too. But there's a very specific example. Back when I was late teens, 20s, even into my 30s, I used to write music a lot. Not because I could, because I'm not trained in any instrument, and as it turned out, I don't have a facility for any instrument, but I managed to hammer away at the keyboard for long enough and sort of, persuasively enough that I managed to become sort of passable at writing songs, not playing them necessarily. So going up, I have been in bands and I have been on stage, and it's always been a disaster. But writing songs I had a 16-track sort of digital studio, and a sort of £500 drum machine, a grand's worth of keyboard, that kind of stuff. So I was able to do it to a reasonable degree. But one of the things takes another swig of tea.
Yes.
One of the things No, we're not doing Depeche Mode just yet.
Yet.
We've already done them. One of the things was, because I was doing it at home, and because a lot of the time I was doing it by myself, I would do it with a drum machine. And the drum machine I had, like I say, it was quite an expensive one, several £100s. And you had two choices over programming it. You could either set it going with a metronome and you'd play the drums live, and you could sort of layer them and add to them, or else you could program it in step by step. And either way, because my sense of rhythm isn't spectacular, if I was trying to do it live, I'd often go way out of beat at certain points, which throws you out as you're adding the layers. And so that's a nightmare. If you're doing it step by step, you come up with a drum beat that is so on the nose on the rhythm that it just has no, well, I say it has no interest at all.
I would take it.
Well, it just becomes a straight line.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
It's just a regular
line, it's not very interesting.
Yeah.
Having said that, a lot of people like music like that, and that's kind of the point I'm getting to. This drum machine had this setting where you could, and I don't know exactly what the right word is, and it's been so long since I've used it now, I can't remember what the setting was called, but you kind of syncopate the pattern so that everything gets thrown just slightly out of the regular rhythm, but into, something that sounds more like a reggae rhythm or a jazz rhythm, but only slightly. And you had, I think on this particular machine, I think you had 14 degrees by which you could do this. And number 14,
wow,
which might have worked for some people, number 14 to me was just like chaos. But number 1 is just a straight line.
Just a regular.
And I found that the setting that worked for me, and that I would always use, because whatever else I tried, this setting was the only setting that I could write music to, was setting number 7, so approximately 50% syncopation. The point I'm making is, for other people, that setting might have been 3, and for other people, that setting might have been 11. 7 worked for me.
So you're saying setting 14 is free jazz, basically?
Yeah, well, or even worse. No, it was like even freer than free jazz.
Oh my God.
It was like running naked into the woods jazz, basically.
So you like just enough order, is what you're saying here?
Just enough order and just enough disorder. But the wider point is that setting worked for me. That wouldn't have worked for other people.
No.
And that's why there's a range of like 14 settings on a machine. And what I'm saying is, when it comes to music, I think everybody has a particular rhythm. And so music that's in your rhythm is going to appeal to you more than music that's not. So, and we'll talk about Blur. And Blur is a band that I ought to like, really. I mean, apart from the sort of Chaz and Dave quality to a lot of their songs. They even did Let's All Go Down the Strand, right? Which you couldn't get much more Chaz and Dave than a cover version of that. But I should like Blur, but I don't especially. And I think the reason is they're just not in my rhythm. So you see what I mean?
That's interesting. Yeah, so it's just the way the songs are constructed. Despite theoretically the ideas, the melodies, maybe the sharpness of the lyrics, they should be in your app. Yeah, absolutely. And there's just something about the band that puts you off.
It doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't quite know what it is. I think somewhere. That's an interesting one.
And I don't think it's necessarily the rhythm itself always. Sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's something to do with the construction.
Could be
but there's something. Yeah, there's something that's going to appeal, and there's something that's just going to hit you in the right spot, and it's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, so the big example of that for me is just the metal songs, essentially, because that's a form of music that has a huge and devoted fan base, but doesn't translate well beyond it, and that has very kind of clear divisions of what it is. You have the heavy drum, you have the heavy bass, and if you just don't get that, you don't gel with that. That's there are very few metal songs I do gel with.
It is weird because you can have bands who do all the things that heavy metal bands do, and yet they won't be regarded as heavy metal. And yet sometimes you can look at them and you can think, well, why aren't they regarded as heavy metal? Because they're doing all the things that heavy metal bands do. And there's this weird invisible dividing line that it's impossible to really sort of define or even see. You can't even mark out where the line is.
And a lot of it, I think, is sometimes presentation. Obviously, because bands, are obviously presented. Someone like Metallica will present very clearly as metal. Iron Maiden present very clearly as metal. But you get, say, Nirvana, who are very close to it at times, don't necessarily present that way.
Mm. Yeah, and so they kind of become distinguished as something else.
Yeah.
Right, let's get back to the story. So we go back to when I was about 14 or 15. And actually, if there are any Blow Monkeys aficionados listening to this, I do know the dates. I do not have the dates in front of me. I did not look up the dates before doing this podcast. And this is not just for the aficionados, but for anybody. Because what I'm going to try and do is do this entirely from memory. So without any recourse to a list of records or anything like that. So I'm going back 40 years and I'm trying to, because I have very distinct memories of certain things. And I think those certain things are sort of the kind of things that people might recognize. So I think it becomes more honest if I do it without looking at the dates and saying, well, that must have been that month in that year. If I can do it without doing that, even if I might get the dates wrong and things like that, what I'm doing is telling a story that comes from in me rather than on a page. And so we go back to the summer of 1985. And so I think the Blow Monkeys' first album had come out a while before this. And so this wasn't a purchase of something that was new. But what happened was this. At that time, I was very much into things that and I suppose certain of my friends would regard as cool things. In other words, cold things. One of my favourite bands was the Sisters of Mercy, and there's no emotional sort of impact from that band at all. It's like this icy cold monolithic sound. But I was into this icy cold monolithic sound at the time because I was 15 and I was pretentious twat, and that's what pretentious twats like, right? I mean, we've all got. Not every.
I have a lot of time for people who like something like This Corrosion. That's great.
I know. I'm way before This Corrosion. I'm talking before the first album, and to very early years.
But yeah, we're talking the kind of the synth sound of the 80s, the stuff that had been kind of dominated since late 70s.
Oh yeah, I'm talking
OMD and Newman and that sort of thing.
No, I'm talking way pre-synth. I'm talking bands that wouldn't go anywhere near a synthesizer. Drums, bass, guitar, vocal, and that was as much as you got. That's what I'm talking. And that's what I liked, or that's what I thought I liked. And the Smiths was just coming up, so that was one of the other things.
Oh,
and the
Smiths, perfect age, yeah.
Exactly. But what happened was, in the back of an edition of Melody Maker or Sounds, I can't remember exactly which one it was, there was this advert for a Sisters of Mercy gig. And I think at this point I'd seen the Sisters of Mercy, but obviously, clearly, if there's an advert for the Sisters of Mercy, you see the logo and you get a little tingle of excitement. Oh. And it was in London. And the support act was the Blow Monkeys, who obviously...
that's kind of, from the end of the decade's point of view, that just looks like chalk and cheese combination.
Weird, yeah.
Totally.
Well, and even at the time, and clearly people listening to this have already gathered that I know Robert somewhat now, and he talks about it as one of those ones where the record company put them up for a support slot that really wasn't suited, but not as unsuited as it would later appear, right?
Absolutely.
But I didn't know that.
I think the weirdest support band I had was I went to see Madness in, I think it was 91, and they had 808 Status as a support act. Because I think one of them was their manager. It didn't go down well, particularly.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Yeah, that's not really two bands that go together in any way, shape. Way worse than this.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the time, the Blow Monkeys weren't, they were quite far removed from the Sisters of Mercy in terms of the aesthetic and the rhythm. Yeah. But actually in terms of, because, well, as you'll discover in a minute, but the Blow Monkeys, so there was just this logo and this name, the Blow Monkeys, and immediately that name kind of catches your attention. I think if it had been anybody else, I wouldn't have remembered it, but the Blow Monkeys is kind of one of those, well, I wonder what that means, and I wonder what it refers to. And it sounds silly, but at the same time as sounding...
in the best British way.
Exactly. Or sinister. And that was the other thing that grabbed me. The name, the Blow Monkeys, has also kind of got this. If you don't have anything to sort of contextualize it with. It's got this slightly oddly sinister quality, like a sort of maybe a Carry On movie with a really much darker edge, something like that.
Yes.
Sort of, it's just, there was something about it that caught my attention, and this was months before. So, you know, time goes on and I'm buying Hand in Glove and I'm buying, you know, Walk Away by the Sisters of Mercy. The Top came out by The Cure, which was the first time since I'd been in. Initially, I'd been into the Human League and Heaven 17, and then had moved on to this darker stuff when I got into puberty, I guess. So The Top by The Cure was the first time since pre-puberty, I guess, let's call that the dividing line, where I'd actually bought something that had other instruments than guitar, bass and drums on. And The Top, I don't think was completely successful. And at first I was a bit put off by it because of all the other instrumentation and thinking, well, I'm not quite sure what they're doing here, but gradually it grew on me. And that's the point at which in the summer of 1985, I think, or maybe the spring of 1980, sometime in 1985, I would put it down as, I walked into Newton Abbot, think it was WH Smith's. It was either WH Smith's or Sounds. I think they had a shop called Sounds, but I think it was WH Smith's because I think there was magazines and books and then at the back records. And I remember this being at the back of the shop and I was just there flicking through the albums. And then the Blow Monkeys debut album is there, Limping for a Generation. And I didn't know about the album, but I remembered instantly the name The Blow Monkeys, having seen it on this advert. And John, a few months ago, just looking for something else, I found that somebody had cut this advert out and was selling it on eBay.
Did you
this
buy it?
Actual advert?
Did you buy this advert? Come on.
Presumably hoping to find a Sisters of Mercy fan who'd want to buy the advert. I mean, what the hell they were doing with the advert after all this time, and why they would cut the magazine out to get it.
I say
but
usually
they did.
Just be the magazine. It'd be
exactly. But no, the actual advert that I'd first seen all those years ago was on eBay. I think it was earlier this year or last year. And yeah, it was £2, including postage from America. So yeah, of course I bought it. I'd be mad not to, wouldn't I? At that price.
See, absolutely. You know, if you're not a fan, that can sound a bit strange, but I can actually relate to it. It's a fundamental part of your fandom. You know, it's something almost random. That's just, yeah. I would absolutely 100% if I saw something like that. You know, a John Fitton advert or something that I didn't have, yeah, I'd be straight on that.
But of course, the other thing about this is this was the very first time I'd ever seen the name, and this was the reason why when I picked this album up, I was instantly, oh, interesting. And of course, the other thing about the album, and you won't probably know this, is the front cover. Now, I can't say I like the front cover because I don't think it's there to be liked, but I think it's there to make a statement. And if I describe what the front cover is, you might appreciate what I mean. It's basically Picasso's. Oh, if you look it up, John's looking it up for the benefit of people listening. If you look it up, I'll show you, John.
Okay.
Oh, hang on. I've got to pull the right copy out because there's 2 copies of this now. It's there. I don't know if you can see that.
I can see that. Yep.
Right.
Very 80s album cover.
But what the artist has done is he's taken the same, or at least this is what it looks like. It looks like he's taken the same photograph from the same angle several different times, but just slightly moved the camera or slightly moved the people. And then he's cut up tiny pieces from each picture and put them all together so that everything in the picture, it's a little bit like Guernica by Picasso, right?
Kind of collage,
yeah, it's a collage, but it's a collage of a single image, if you know what I mean.
Yes. So
it's got this really weird quality where everything about it is just slightly thrown off, and it's sort of weirdly ugly, but at the same time absolutely fascinating.
But
and so
it's almost pristine, isn't it? It's almost got it's got that 80s kind of the actual design of it. It's a nice little clash between the actual the imagery and the design of the 80s kind of precision design of the cover.
And I don't know if you can see from there, but if you look closely in the background, there are Picasso type drawings on the wall.
Oh God, yeah.
So it's very clear that the influence is Picasso. And it's odd because given that Picasso's Spanish and given where Dr. Robert ultimately ends up, that's kind of, it kind of draws his career in a full circle. But again, the point I'm coming back to is, given how fascinating the cover is, and given that I remember this name from this advert in the back of this magazine, there's no way I'm not going to buy this album, especially as, you know, I said this was not on release. This was a little time afterwards. So it was discounted from, I think albums at the time were $3.99, and I distinctly remember this was $2.85. So that was like a third off. So I was like, oh, a third off. Yeah, give me that. So I thought I'll buy this. And I thought I'll take it home, and it's going to be like the Sisters of Mercy, right? Because they were supporting the Sisters of Mercy, so it's going to be like the Sisters of Mercy. It has to be. So I took it home and I put it on, and the opening track starts with just naked drums for just one bar, basically, or just a tiny bit. It's a lot shorter. It's a lot quicker than you kind of would expect it to. If it had been a deliberate drum intro, it would probably have gone on for like 30 seconds or a minute or something, but it's not. It just has this very brief drum intro, and as soon as the drums kicked in, I was like, whoa, that is not anything like the Sisters of Mercy.
No.
Because essentially it's got this sort of, it's got a pop rhythm, but it's got a jazz rhythm, and the two things are layered so close together that it's sort of instantly unique, and you've never heard anything like it, and it instantly draws you in. This, and you know, again, Robert's spoken about this himself, that drum intro is the reason why they put that track first, because it just instantly hooks you. And I was like, in just the 5 or 6 seconds that drum intro goes on for, I was like, this is not the kind of thing I like, but I like this more already before I've even heard the instruments than anything else that I do like. I was just absolutely transfixed. And then the music comes in, and I've been listening to music that was just bass and guitars, and the music comes in, and instantly it's saxophone and a string section, and I am way out of my comfort zone, but utterly mesmerized by this song. And it carried on like that throughout the 10 songs of the album. There's quite a lot of variety on the album, actually. The thing is, I discovered years later, and this is why I connected back to the Sisters of Mercy a bit. The music press at the time was describing them as jazz punk.
Yeah, interesting. They come up with some odd. But you look again, because I come back to them from later in the decade. It feels more in line with kind of Sade, and you know, not to be insulting at all, but it's kind of
the Level 42. Yeah.
Level 42. The kind of, they have the elements. It's
the white, blue-eyed soul kind of thing.
That's exactly it.
That's where they were pigeonholed.
Yeah, absolutely. And the saxophone did become kind of a almost shorthand for blandness later in the decade. But no, I mean, this is interesting as well, because the way you come to it, because you come to it from, again, something that's absolutely unlike what you're listening to. And I'll give it, it's a story you almost can't tell these days, because if you go, okay, the Blow Monkeys, you bring it up on whichever streaming service,
YouTube or Spotify, yeah.
You can sample it, and you can go almost, one song, and you dump it, and you almost don't get that kind of immersive experience of something that really opens your mind up. Maybe you just tend to go away from it at times.
Now I'll tell you the other amazing thing about this record, because you kind of get used to it, because like I said, I started basically with Human League and Adam and the Ants, to Heaven 17, progressed on to The Cure and Sisters of Mercy, and because of all the other things that my parents listened to and all the other things that you were exposed to on the radio and television, and because by this time the 80s is kind of bedded in, so bands like Duran Duran and Wham and that are around by this point, and I think the 80s probably really starts sort of 82, maybe something like that, because decades never really start and finish exactly on the spot. But yeah, we're into the 80s by now, so you kind of expect a verse chorus format, And with pop music, you kind of expect a verse, chorus format. And this was clearly more pop than anything I'd been listening to. And this goes back to the fact that Dr. Robert, he never trained as a musician. He never learnt his trade in a band as a musician. He never trained himself to be a band member or a band leader. He started by picking up a guitar. One day when he was at home alone, his sister's guitar and a book of songs, and he just started playing along and realized he had a facility for it.
Oh, nice.
And then from that point, he was playing by himself. So he would busk and things like that. And he's writing songs himself eventually before he becomes a member of a band. And I think the thing that really tells then is he's not trained in that kind of verse chorus way. So this first Blow Monkeys album, more so than most of the stuff he's done since, but this is a thread that goes throughout his entire career. There's no rules. There's no songwriting rules anywhere on the album. I think the track that I gave you 2 tracks on the playlist, and I know you've not had a chance to listen to the playlist much, but one of them is Atomic Lullaby, which is track 3 on here.
Absolutely.
And that was a single. That was a single that came out before the album. It's got no chorus. It's not the obvious
one. No, it's not an obvious. But I kind of like that about it, because again, it was something I think JR gave me a playlist and said it'll open your ears, basically, which is fair enough. And I was going, I kind of. So I was kind of half expecting something different from the saxophone and the jet, and yeah, it did. And one of the things I really did love about playlist, and we'll come back to it, is the way the music develops over the years.
Yeah.
And there is, I don't want to say sophistication, but it's almost like the craft. It's someone who knows their craft and is pushing what they can do with it all the way through, which I found a really interesting thing.
Yes, and I think that's the story of his entire musical career, is that he's never satisfied with learning how to do something and then just doing that thing, but he's always saying, right, what can I do that I can't do, that I can learn and that I can move on to? And he talks about the fact that during the 80s he left his audience behind, and spoilers ahoy, that's going to be me. I'm going to be part of the audience that gets left behind in the 80s, because he's always moving on. Each album is a development from the next. And you talk about remembering Wait is so different from Digging Your Scene. If you played the two side by side, you'd never be able to say that it was the same artist on both if you didn't already know, because it just sounds like a completely different act. And in a way, it kind of is, because Wait is sort of Dr. Robert's solo song.
It's a solo.
Technically,
I know it gets credited to the Blow Monkeys now, but yes, it was.
But it's on a Blow Monkeys album, yeah.
Yeah.
And kind of the point is that by that point he was off doing his own thing a bit anyway, and I suspect that's part of the reason why the band broke up in the end. But anyway, coming back to Limping for a Generation, so throughout the entire album there are no songs really that have a verse chorus format. The most obvious single on there is Wildflower, track 2, which is amazingly catchy. They're all really catchy, actually. That's one of the things about them. Wildflower is this amazingly catchy, sort of strummy, very 60s-esque sort of pop song without a chorus. It's got so many different bridges and middle eights and other things that by the end of the song you've convinced yourself that you've been listening to a sort of first chorus formatted song. But it's only when you actually sort of think back and dig into it that it never actually did get to a chorus. It just carried on through all these other different bits and kept coming back to this particular refrain, that it got away with being this sort of instantly catchy pop song without having a chorus in it at all. And this is kind of the story across the whole album, is that there's nothing on there that really has that verse chorus format that you kind of expect to hear on a pop band. And then they went on, and the next thing they did was Animal Magic, which is the breakthrough. So that's the one that starts with Digging Your Scene. And I have to say, given that this sort of what the music press called jazz punk thing going on this first album, and it's not punk. I think the sort of punk part comes from the can-do ethos that you associate with punk. In other words, is this
it's that kind. There's a streak in 80s pop of this. I think it's there in the bands you mentioned earlier. It's there in ABC, Heaven 17. Dexys. It's there in even the Pet Shop Boys. It's that attitude of here's one chord, here's another chord, here's third. Now go and form a band. That's what it is. But they were applying it instead of the two guitar, the bass band, guitar, bass, drum, singer. It's applied to the pop song, and that's why I really like this period of pop.
It's a lot of people breaking boundaries, not because they see where the boundaries are and they want to bust through them, but because these are people who haven't been taught to appreciate the boundaries and to respect the boundaries, and so they just do other things instead. And so there's a streak of bands and I mean, obviously this goes back to the Beatles. Really, the Beatles were the first ones who just said, let's forget about the boundaries and just do what we want. But and I think, and I know your favorite band, and we'll do them at some point in the not too distant future, is the Super Furry Animals, about whom I know nothing, and I'm now about to start a journey of educating myself. But also, I mean, one of the reasons why, and I should have done this years ago, but somehow they've just always been off my radar, but I also know that they're a band for whom those boundaries don't exist, and that's what I like. And so Digging Your Scene came out, and Limping for a Generation had been a record that had not left my record player in the entire time since I bought it. And more spoilers, it hasn't in the 40 years since, in the near 40 years since. It's probably my most played record of all time, because even during periods when and we'll get to this, not been into music so much, if I'm going to put a record on, I'm going to put something on that I can be familiar with, and it's always been this one. This has always been the record that I've gone back to. It's clearly my favorite record of all time, and it's clearly my most played record of all time. But Animal Magic gives it a run for its money, but it didn't immediately, because Digging Your Scene came out, and I thought, oh, that band I really like, whose record I still play at least once a week, I've suddenly made this record that's so far out of my comfort zone, I'm not there for it. And actually,
did
Digging
you
Your
see
Scene,
that selling out?
I don't think I saw it as selling out so much as taking a sideways step that left me behind. And I'll tell you why, because the album came out, unless I'm misremembering, the album came out fairly soon afterwards. And I love Limping for a Generation so much. I bought Animal Magic instantly, thinking I hope the rest of the album isn't like Digging Your Scene, but is more like Limping for a Generation. And the truth is, the rest of the album is sort of somewhere in between. So it's not like Limping for a Generation, but it has that same inventiveness and that same lack of respect for the boundaries. And there's only about 2 or 3 songs that are a bit like Digging Your Scene. And I discovered later that one of the reasons perhaps why Digging Your Scene had got my back up is because the record company had liked it so much, they'd sent it off to America so that a producer could strip it of the actual bass and drums that had been played by the band members on the record and replace them with machines. So there's a drum machine and like a sequenced bass instead.
So it's really got that surfacey. But
so it's missing that thing at the heart of the band, that that drummer was the reason I got into them in the first place, and he's not here. So
he's lost the rhythm, as we were saying earlier. You've
the subconscious
absolutely. No, that's fascinating. But it's always a canny move though to kind of lead off with a big pop single, because you've got particularly in those days when if you wanted to hear a band, you had to go buy the album, and you could you had to listen to the album. You had to listen to it all the way through almost. So it's a really canny move to just get listeners in. And what else can I do? I really like that again. Smart.
Well, I've got to be honest as well. Digging Your Scene is a song I appreciate. I've come to appreciate so much more over the years, especially as I've now heard lots of other versions of it, including they put out eventually the original band version.
Is that on the reissue?
Yeah, there's a 2-disc reissue. Yeah. just got, and of course that's not for me the definitive version because I'm so used to the other version.
Absolutely.
But it's so nice to hear it. And the thing about that album was it was a bit like Limping for a Generation, but a bit not. And I didn't really appreciate it at first. But weirdly, over time, that's another record that just never left my record player. And so I just kept playing it and playing it and playing it and loving it more and more and more each time. And I'm going to speed things up because we've been talking for more than half an hour and we're basically still at the start of the story. So through the rest of the 80s, there was a friend I had at school who I introduced. I lent him a copy of Limping for a Generation. I can't remember what he liked, something. And I thought, oh, he might like the Blow Monkeys. So I lent it to him. This was before Animal Magic came out. And then we both discovered Animal Magic together. I think he liked it more than I did initially. And then I came to like it more than he did over the course of, you know, a few months or whatever. And then when the one afterwards came out, the single was It Doesn't Have to Be This Way.
That was it. She Was Only Grocer's Daughter, something like that.
Yeah, and that's yeah. And that song was like their biggest hit. But to me, it just felt a bit like Digging Your Scene Mark II.
Yeah, it just. I was going to say it feels so much like a repeat of. It's almost the same tricks again.
And yeah, I think it's a really, really good song. And if you hear the demo as well, especially, that teases out the differences more than the similarities. I think what happened is they've obviously clearly the record company maybe nudged them into, but they've clearly produced
give us another single. Yes.
Yeah, and clearly it's the production that kind of makes it sound more similar, because in terms of the song structure, it's actually very different, really. But the single that came out, and I bought that, and I kind of thought, oh, I'm not really quite sure. And I asked this guy at school, he bought the record, the album. And I asked him, well, what do you think of the album? And he said, well, it's a bit like the last one, but just not as good. And I thought, yeah, that's probably it for me then. And I stopped. And given how much I had loved Limping for a Generation, and by this point had come to love Animal Magic almost as much, I can't believe I stopped. But I stopped buying their records and sort of stopped taking an interest at that point. Now, whenever there was a song out or they were on Top of the Pops or whatever, my interest would get piqued, but never quite enough that I'd go and buy another record, which is madness when you look back at it now, right?
Oh God, yeah. It's kind of, you see them and they, oh yeah, that thing I loved. You've still got that kind of trace memory of what you loved about them, but you don't go out of your way to find the records.
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to explain though in a lot of ways.
And then the absolutely most insane thing is throughout this entire period, I'm still playing Limping for a Generation and Animal Magic once a week because I love them still so much. I'm just still playing them constantly. And like I say, I've never stopped. So that's slightly odd. Now, sort of where this gets a bit interesting, and this kind of, we're both Doctor Who fans. So you, as a Doctor Who fan, you might recognise this too, because in the Wilderness years, I lost interest in Doctor Who. And my interest picked back up before the announcement that it was going to come back. So I kind of, at the tail end of the Wilderness years, for some reason, my interest just got piqued again, and I started buying the magazine and buying the VHSs. Maybe it was when they started releasing them on DVD. That's it. It was when they started releasing them on DVD.
99-ish, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Then the similarities are even more pronounced. Because what happened with the Blow Monkeys was Animal Magic and Limping for a Generation had been released on vinyl, because they basically preceded CD. In fact, I think Animal Magic might have been the first one that was released on CD, because I think it was just on the cusp of CD becoming a thing, 1986.
Yeah, back when Brothers in Arms came out and made it that huge thing, yeah.
But I didn't have a CD player at the time, so I bought it on vinyl. So come 1990, the Blow Monkeys split up, and I was still interested enough that I was aware of the fact that they'd split up, I think, I'm pretty sure. And so they were still on the sort of periphery of my interest. And I was still playing Limping for a Generation weekly, but I had no CD of it. But at this point, there was starting to be CD writers on the market. Yeah. I think or very early sort of 90s, I think. And of course, this was the point at which they'd start to be compilation albums. And so I found a copy of Animal Magic on CD. So I had that on CD. So I was playing this on CD now. And what I did with Limping for a Generation was I put it on CD from the vinyl. But of course, it's crackly. And I've had this vinyl, I've played this vinyl 1,000 times. So it's not in the best of condition. And so I tried to find a copy of Limping for a Generation on CD, but it's not been released at this point. But instead, there's a couple of, well, at this point, I think there was just one, and there was another one just shortly on the horizon. Compilation albums, which had a couple of tracks from it. So what I started to do was pick up the odd tracks so that I could replace the tracks on my CD that I'd written myself with ones from CDs that had been officially released that were in slightly better condition.
iTunes must have been an absolute dream for you when it came along.
Well, no, by that point, I'd managed, and I mean, later in the decade, I managed to get a copy of Limping for a Generation from Germany. I think I didn't have a computer at the time, but I think as soon as somebody I knew, maybe my parents or maybe a friend, had a computer, and it may have been before eBay. So it would have been very early on, but I managed to find a copy of Limping for a Generation in Germany and got it sent over quite expensively. I think, if I remember rightly, it wasn't cheap. It wasn't like hugely expensive, but it was a bit more than you'd normally pay for a CD. But it was this album that I was still playing every week 10 years later.
But it's a talisman, it's a touchstone, and you go further. I mean, that's why. I know REM are doing the 25th anniversary issues and stuff. I don't go for all of them, but I know the ones I will go for. Even though it's frankly, most people look go, what are you spending that on that for? Or even Doctor Who with the Blu-rays, same thing.
Well, yes, exactly. Totally. And like I'm saying, the DVDs with Doctor Who, the CDs with the Blow Monkeys, that's what drew me back in. And of course, because I'm doing this now, it's only a little bit after the fact, but now I'm going back and buying the Blow Monkeys records that I had missed. So by the sort of early to mid 90s, now I'm starting to do all the things that I should have done at the time they happened back in the 1980s. And then what's interesting, there's it felt like a fallow period for Dr. Robert. The last Blow Monkeys album was 1990. His first solo album in this country is, and now again, I'm going to fudge the dates because I'm remembering it as 95 and I think it's actually 96. I think he wrote it in 95 and recorded it, and it was released in Japan in 95 and came out in 96. Don't cheat on my account, John. I don't want to know. I'll look it up after.
I'm just on the actual playlist you gave me. I was looking on the dates on that because you put dates on there.
Oh yeah,
and it says 95, 96. So I'm taking your word for it.
Oh, there you go. His first solo album comes out, and he's done other things in the meantime. He's written with other people. He's had projects. He's done producing. He's played on tour with Paul Weller and played on a couple of his albums. But the first Dr. Robert solo album is the first time that he's been the sort of lead artist in 5 years, in half a decade. And in these 5 years since the band broke up and all these CDs have come out, and I've had a bit of a mini renaissance with the Blow Monkeys and started getting into Springtime for the World and She Was Only a Grocer's Daughter. So now I'm ready. And Realms of Gold comes out, and Realms of Gold is this incredibly stripped back production. And sort of spoilers ahoy again, that's going to be a phrase that I'm going to repeat a lot during this episode, I'm guessing. So I've discovered afterwards that this, in fact, is basically the case. But it sounds like a group of musicians just go into a studio and literally play live and record what they play. But the songs are the production is so stripped back. And when I say stripped back, it's got lots of instruments on there. But what's stripped back about it is there's no effects on there. There's no reverbs and things like that. Yeah. There's nothing on there that makes it sound like a produced record. It just sounds like a really naked recording, but it's so well played by somebody who across that 5 years, and because of the experimentation that he did with the Blow Monkeys at the end of the 80s, he's learned, or he's learning and developing and evolving through all these new things. So it's a completely, entirely different record to anything the Blow Monkeys did, but it's as instantaneous as Limping for a Generation was. And it's, well, you know, this is my 3 favourite albums are Limping, Animal Magic and Realms of Gold. And there's one other by another band that we'll get to on this podcast at some point in the future. But these 3, this is a sort of jazz folk album, but a really stripped back sound, a really bare sound, but a really full sound at the same time. It's incredible.
So is this kind of your favourite albums, falling in love, Big Affair, and then falling back in love?
That's kind of the point of telling the story.
Absolutely.
The way I am. And we're going to come back to that again, because that happens another time. Although there are other reasons. Other reasons.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of when you're going back to that after you'd fallen out of love with them, kind of how did you kind of find that? How did you kind of receive the music, so to speak, as opposed to how you found Limping and Animal Magic?
Oh, do you mean the albums that I'd missed and bought after?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
There's nothing on any of them that I don't like, but there's nothing on any of them that I love as much as I did on those first 2.
No, this is interesting because I think you go back. It's just something. It's not the stuff you fell in love with. It doesn't mean so much to you because it doesn't. It's not anchored to a kind of point in your life as the way Limping was for you, for instance, and Realms of Gold days.
And actually, the funny thing is, they play some of the tracks from that sort of later 80s period still in their live set from time to time. They mix their live set up. So every time they go on tour, they play a different set of songs. I think they generally always play digging the big hits. They generally always play those because I think that I think it's, I mean, apart from anything else, a lot of them are kind of really funky. So it's not like it feels like work going through the popular songs, because I think they're so enjoyable to play that actually it's a pleasure just to play them anyway, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, they're a pleasure to listen to. Let's face it, it's so beautifully done.
Well, quite. But what they've done with the songs later in the 80s, because I think those last 3 albums in the 80s, I think, and see, for me, maybe this is part of the reason why I couldn't get into them quite as much. I think the production starts to take over a bit from the songwriting. And at points, it starts to be a bit more. And I think this is really the story of the 80s anyway, isn't it? By the end of the decade, it's more about the production than the songwriting.
Yeah.
And I think
there's. You won't think you put anyone up front for it.
Yeah. And so I think there's slightly an issue with that there. But what's amazing, I think, is that in the live set, they can't do the songs in the way they did on the records. So something like Wait or Choice in the live set is this really lithe, funky, sort of quite hard-hitting track that's a million miles away from what it sounded like on the record. And they're on YouTube. There are versions of them on YouTube, but it's just not quite the same as being there in the room when they're playing it. If you're in the room when they're playing Wait these days live, that is just a phenomenal experience. And I'll try and point you to the best version of Wait that's on YouTube. I was going to do it before we did this, but then I thought, no, I better not. But I'll point you towards that afterwards, because that is a phenomenal song these days. And I wish they would re-record it in the new version. But to get back to the story, so Dr. Roberts' first solo album, Realms of Gold, absolute instant classic for me, vying with Limping for a Generation as favourite album of all time. And again, it's one that I've just never stopped playing, because it's just, there are so many textures and so many surprises that even when you know it backwards, things still sort of take you by surprise, because it's just so filled with moments that come sort of entirely naturally, but out of the blue, if you know what I mean. It's not a song that's in any way not an album that's in any way predictable in any of its moments, even to the point where there's one of the tracks on there, they recorded a band version of it, but when they were doing pre-promotion before the record was going to come out, he was doing a radio show, and on the radio they said, can you play one of the songs? And he just pulled out an acoustic guitar and played an acoustic version of this song. And then realised afterwards that the acoustic version had that much more immediacy than the band version that they'd recorded. So band version comes off the record, acoustic version goes on. And so because this record came out in Japan like a year before it came out in the UK, there was plenty of time to make those changes and make it as perfect as it was. And so the Dr. Robert solo albums that come after that, by that point, I'm interested enough, and I'm not making the same mistake I made in the 80s, sort of letting sort of teenage ideas of what's fashionable and what's right hold any sway. By this point, I know this is the band that I like. This is the artist that I like. So I'm buying all these records and not loving them all as much as Realms of Gold, because that was a tipping point. But, you know, basically, none of them were disappointments in any way. And over the, I mean, some of them were instantly sort of records that I really took to. And even the ones that weren't necessarily ones that I instantly took to, you know, there's still plenty on there that I like. And I don't think he's recorded a single song in his entire career that I wouldn't play for enjoyment as opposed to homework or something, because obviously I'm doing a bit of that now, as some people listening to this will know. But then the Blow Monkeys came back, and that was kind of a weird moment, because when I heard that the Blow Monkeys were reforming, because I'm doing all this from in the West Country, and he's never played, insofar as I've been aware, because I you know, in the times when you don't have computer, you don't necessarily always get to hear about things. I don't think he's ever played anywhere near or near enough at a time when I've had the wherewithal to actually go and see him. So even at this point, 1990s, end of the 1990s into the noughties, never seen them live. So I've seen videos. There's been a couple of DVDs and what have you, and things have turned up on the internet. So I've got about half a dozen sort of full concerts that I have access to that I can watch, but I've never seen them live at this point. And so when the Blow Monkeys reformed, I was kind of like, oh, I wonder why, and I wonder where that's come from, and I wonder what it's going to be. And I kind of expected their sort of comeback record. I didn't know what to expect. I thought it can either be them trying to get back to old glories, and probably entirely unsuccessfully, and that'll be a big disappointment, because, you know, you can't go back. Or else it'll be a bit like his solo stuff, in which case it'll probably be a bit of a disappointment too, because it'll be like Dr. Robert, but with the band, and that probably won't sound quite right. And in the end, actually, it was perfect, because when they came back, it was with the maturity of his solo records, but it was with the sort of band dynamics of the originals. And they've recorded some beautiful music, which is sort of mature, but has that kind of, still's got that sort of funky, sort of soul influenced, but jazz influenced, but blues influenced, but folk influenced, lots of influences in a melting pot.
See, I was listening to the latest album, I'm thinking, I was just myself wondering what they do with the Bond theme for a start off, because there's some absolutely beautifully expansive music on there, which was, you know, absolutely perfect. I think it was something, was it The World Is Not Enough was my reference point on that one. I think particularly it's got the big strings right off. Yeah, I thought that's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, because as it transpires, one of his big influences is Bacharach and David. But he doesn't try to be or do Bacharach and David. He has all these other influences at the same time, like folk and jazz and soul and, you know, all sorts of things. Funk, a lot of his stuff actually has been quite funky. Each of his albums seems to, generally speaking, each of the albums will have a sort of a theme, and the theme will be about half the album, and then the rest of the album will be sort of like a variety of other different things. Yeah. And so there's one, for example, that's like a glam rock album. So there's like maybe 4 or 5 glam rock. I mean, his biggest influence, or his big band that he got into at first, was T-Rex. But basically, sort of 10th Blow Monkeys album, the 5th of the, no, 9th Blow Monkeys album, 4th of the sort of revived Blow Monkeys, is a glam rock album. But it's only glam rock for about 4 or 5 songs, and then it's a Blow Monkeys album for the rest of it. But the great thing about
that, because T-Rex is almost just the most basic form of rock and roll. It's a good template to get into, because you can grow from there.
But the thing as well is it makes each of those albums feel really distinct from all the others, and yet at the same time they sort of really cohere together. So it feels like a progression. It feels like they're really having fun. Basically, what they're doing is they're doing the thing they do, but they're really having fun with it and leaning in different directions each time. So Journey to You is like the Bacharach and David album, but it's not just Bacharach and David. It's got a slight hint of that. And in some places, Time Storm, I think, for example, comes across very Bacharach and David.
Absolutely.
But then there are other times like Unicorn Kisses where it goes off and does something that sort of feels really quite different instead. But it feels like a coherent whole, because between them, and coming back to where I came in on this conversation, it's always that rhythm going on, whether it's actually a rhythm or just something in the heart of the music that sort of beats to my rhythm. And so I don't suppose I'm going to go much further, because I've been talking for about an hour anyway, and I think that's probably about as much as anybody really needs to hear. But so I'm going to ask you now, that playlist, do you remember much of it? And do you remember, apart from the fact that it feels like a progression, say, it feels like somebody always pushing, but did it surprise you, given that probably you'd known Digging Your Scene and Wait?
Yeah, I was looking. I think was it the second or third track was almost that conventional one that I might kind of expected from some like Digging Your Scene, or It Doesn't Have to Be This Way.
It Pays to Belong.
Pays to Belong. Yes, that was. But the rest of it, yeah, it's almost because you kind of pre-warned me. I wasn't that surprised about, how different it was, particularly given I'm kind of used to 80s bands who will come at their favorite music or the music they want to make in that punk way. It's a really kind of, it was only a dozen songs long, but it's wide ranging in that 12 songs. Let me get the up again. Yeah, I mean, you put Atomic Lullaby was the first thing on there. It's just that isn't what I expected Blow Monkeys record to sound like at first, but in a very good way. And and you see you can hear the progression, and there were none of the obvious hits on this playlist, because I don't need to hear the obvious playlist, because
exactly.
I've heard it so many times. Yeah. And the stuff I was really getting into was the back end of the playlist. The Work Away to Cover Me, Okay Have It Your Way, Act of Faith, Journey to You. That I went, no, it's a band who the music industry's changed, hasn't it? You don't have that big, they're not gatekeepers anymore. You don't have to go put a big single up front on it. It's a band who are, in the best way, doing what they want while retaining that audience they've got. It's very exploratory stuff, I would say. You associate your experimental bands with, I know, someone like Throbbing Gristle, Kraftwerk, etc. But they're experimenting in exactly that way, but in an entirely less abrasive way, I would say.
They've got a sound, and they've got, like I keep coming back to, this rhythm. They've got this rhythm and they've got this sound, but within that, they can do almost anything.
Yeah, and actually, put different styles on it. It's sort of chameleonic, I think.
He says the one thing he'd never do is heavy metal, but actually, there's a track on his fifth solo album, Birds Gotta Fly. Fifth solo album, Birds Gotta Fly. That is a heavy metal track. There's no two ways about it. It's a funky metal track, but it is a heavy metal track. There's no two ways about it. So when he says the one thing he'd never do is heavy metal, he lies.
The doctor lies. Yeah,
exactly. But you know what I mean? So that's one of his solo things. But even so, there's no boundary that you couldn't push at. If you're not trained and you've come from this position of just not having a rule book to tear up, not having the rule book in the first place, so you don't recognize what the rules are. And so throughout his career, I think he's always, I see, the weird thing is, my partner said to me, well, she's not a fan, and because I was playing a lot of Blow Monkeys and Dr. Robert records, she was like, can we listen to something else? But then one time she says to me, sort of apropos of nothing, she says, actually, as a songwriter, he's really underrated, isn't he? Because I think she'd come to appreciate that actually, you've got your Bob Dylans, and whatever else, and your Radioheads. And there are certain bands that are fashionable, certain artists that are fashionable, and I seem to have changed things. The Blow Monkeys, I don't think they changed anything, because I don't think there was an influence there that made other people say, oh, we'll have some of that. But the weird thing is, going back to that very first drum beat on that very first song that I heard in 1985 at the start of their very first album, do you know what that drum beat is? That was the one that the Stone Roses took in 1989 and turned into a musical phenomenon. That was the drum beat.
Yeah, the Rennie one. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you know what I mean? The Blow Monkeys
a bit
did
of funk to it. Yeah.
5 years before it was fashionable, and it was there, and it was them doing it. And for me, that's always been the thing. They've been ahead of the time. They've been out of time. They've been out of step. But they're just this huge tapestry of musical texture that I think basically fulfills every musical need I really kind of have, if you know what I mean. It's like if I want to listen to something comic, there are Dr. Robert songs that are comic that I can listen to. If I want to listen to something dark and foreboding, or something soft and lilting, or something stark and terrifying, all these things are somewhere in this sort of back catalogue. And going back to what I was saying about falling out of love and coming back into love, there was a period in the 2010s where I was in a relationship, still in the relationship, had a stepchild, then had a child. We weren't set, given my hours, because of the job I do, I wasn't set up to listen to music. And I didn't have a car at the time either, so I wasn't listening to music in the car. So I went through a period of a few years. I couldn't say exactly how long, but it was a few years. It was like at least 5 years where I didn't really listen to any music at all. Certainly not any new music. So if I listened to any music, it would be something that I would have to choose out of something I knew. So I'd put on a record I knew rather than trying to discover something new, because I might not get through this new record for months and months and months. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you've got so little time for music, and I wasn't disappointed or pissed off about this. This was, like a choice I was making in my life, and I was happy with the choice I was making. And the only records that I would come back to were Realms of Gold, Animal Magic, and Limping for a Generation. Those were the only records I played during that period. And occasionally some of his other records that he'd put out solo in the time before. But during that period, I missed a couple of Blow Monkeys albums, and I missed two again. So I missed two Blow Monkeys albums and two solo albums, I think, in this period. So I was able to rediscover those afterwards and have a sort of mini Blow Monkeys renaissance when I got to a point where I was listening to new music again. And so so the nice thing about this story is I kind of had 3 times when I've been able to fall in love with this band. And it was only on the 3rd time, on those first 2 times, even though I was listening to Limping for a Generation over and over and over and over again, because I wasn't listening to the others, if you'd have asked me what my favourite band was, I would never have said the Blow Monkeys. If you'd have asked me who my favourite singer was, my favourite songwriter was, I would never have said Dr. Robert, because it just wouldn't have occurred to me, because there were things of theirs that I hadn't sort of picked up and fallen in love with at the time. And so there were a band that might have made my favourite records, but I also made records that weren't. And I would have, if you'd have asked me for a favourite, it would have to be somebody who I loved every record of. But it's on this 3rd time around now where you just kind of go, no, actually, they are my favourite band. And it doesn't matter that there's a couple of records that I don't like as much, because...
As Doctor Who fans, it's something like whenever Eva finishes,
yes,
it's everything eventually gets reappraised, because afterwards it didn't go entirely that way, so you can always listen to it without the kind of angst.
Well, and yes, as a Doctor Who fan, there are seasons, there are stories, there are periods that you don't like, but it doesn't mean that it's not still your favourite television programme.
Absolutely.
And I've just basically come to that same realisation about this band.
Yeah, I've kind of come up with this. It's the variety I like. I like the versatility in the music. So that's what I will be after this, over the next few weeks, going through the Blow Monkeys back catalogue. And that's entirely your fault, JR. Okay. Which I'm sure you're delighted with anyway.
Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed the journey. And I don't know whether if anybody who's listening to this has been intrigued enough to pick up one of those records, then job done. And if not, I hope the conversation was interesting and that we've touched on things that even if you don't necessarily like that band and that artist, might remind you of things from your own past about bands and artists that you do like. Because I think that's the thing about musical. That's the thing about music and our appreciation of it. Even if we like different types of music, I think we like those different types of music often in the same way.
Yeah.
And so it's the music, the fact that it's music, I think that binds us rather than necessarily always the actual music.
Yeah, it's almost not important what you fall in love. It's just as long as you fall in love with something, almost.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm assuming anybody who's listening to a podcast called Music Club will appreciate what we're saying. What they won't appreciate, though, is the fact that 2 days ago on the Michael Jackson podcast, we said we were going to be talking about Shalimar next, and we didn't.
But hopefully we gave them a night to remember anyway.
Oh, and on that note, I was JR.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.